The first thing I do want to say is this is going to be a very, very sketchy and by no means comprehensive thing on medieval wall paintings. And I hope that you'll be able to see the pictures properly. Some of them are so faded, it's quite difficult to see them clearly. Now, probably just about as soon as internal church walls began to be covered with smooth plaster, the habit of painting on them began. Even in Saxon times, there were a few stone churches, and some of these must have had paintings. But for all practical purposes, wall painting in the English church dates from after the Norman conquest, and a few 11th century paintings still survive. This interior at Hardham in Sussex dates from the 12th century, and is probably one of the earliest full schemes yet found in Britain. It seems to have been conceived as a unified whole from the start and illustrates Christian history from the temptation and fall of man to the redemptive intervention by Christ. The subjects painted come mainly from Christian history, though some secular scenes appear, and there's much decorative painting, scroll work, flower and leaf patterns, and so on. Christian history in the Middle Ages, though, involved a great deal more than the Christian story as narrated in the New Testament. Many of the accretions that clustered around the gospel accounts were firmly believed in as historical fact, things like the story of Longinus. Although specific parallels between what was preached in the church and the stories that appeared on the walls are hard to track down, the painted wall clearly had much the same didactic intention as the sermon. In other words, teaching Christian truth as it was understood, and improving people's behaviour through moral instruction and example. This painting here is the Death of the Virgin from Purton in Wiltshire. This painting also puts paid to the old idea that early church wall painting in England, or indeed elsewhere, is best described as primitive or naive. There is an elegance and subtlety about this one in particular that's outstanding. From the start, the materials were the simplest. The universal use of earth pigments, red and yellow ochre, reflects the fact they were widely and cheaply available. Cheaply is important. Cost will be a real consideration, as a large area had to be covered. So red and yellow ochre, together with black derived from soot and white from chalk, variously mixed to provide a surprisingly wide range of shades, form the basic palettes. Blues are rare. The stable pigment ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, cost more than gold leaf, and even cheaper blues were expensive. Green, usually a copper salt, is sometimes found, and occasionally the brighter but thoroughly unstable red, vermilion. And also, as you can do an amazing amount of kidding the eye that it's seeing blue by putting grey alongside red or yellow. This is the paint maker's workbench and his raw materials here, red and yellow ochre, as they would arrive in the studio. The most important tool is the muller and plate, used for grinding down earths and rocks to powder before the true paint making begins, and then again as the basic tool for actually producing paint. Manufacturing paints was the tedious part of the exercise. These are the tools of the trade: pigment in a jar, palette knife, shell, muller, and plate. The powdered pigment is put in a small pile in the middle of the plate, and the medium is added. Here, egg whites are being used to produce tempera paint, but the wallpapers will generally have used a casein binding made from sour milk and mixed in with a palette knife. This prevents the powder from flying everywhere when you get on to the next stage. Vital if you're using something toxic and expensive like this true vermilion. You then take your muller and you sweep it, bring a swirling motion on the plate until the pigment medium mix is absolutely smooth. And this can take anything from 10 minutes to 5 hours. And you add more medium if you need to get it to the right consistency. Finally, you place the ready-to-use paint in a shell. Obviously, for wall painting, the quantities will be considerably bigger. This is producing paint for illuminations, but the principles will be exactly the same. Some underdrawing does seem to have gone on, but after that, the paint went straight onto the prepared wall. Preparation in this case being limited to a coat of sizing material, usually based on casein, or a small thin skim of lime plaster. True fresco, where a fresh area of wet plaster is worked on with a powdered pigment immediately after application, is extremely rare in the English parish church and is almost entirely found in the really early examples, such as these paintings of Ickleton, this Last Supper, shown here. In true fresco, only a relatively small area could be worked, and the artist had to move extremely fast. Usually, however, paintings would be executed on an already rendered wall, and the secco technique was used. A fresh skim of fine plaster would be applied to the walls, and a rough outline of the painting scratched into it before it was fully dry. Alternatively, a full-size drawing would be produced, and the outline transferred to the wall by pouncing, pushing pigment through pinprick holes in the cartoon drawing to transfer an outline onto the plaster. And you can see in this picture of the tools of the trade there, and you can see the outline of that wall painting outlined in black dots, which are where the powder has been pushed through a transfer. Brushes were made of hog bristles and squirrel hair. Traces have been recovered during some restorations. Bristle brushes were made initially as very large brushes and used for a while as plasterers' brushes. For painting use, these big brushes were then taken apart and made up into small specialized brushes, the bristles being tied round the point of a wooden handle with wax thread. Squirrel, miniver brushes, made in various sizes. Here, the bunches of hair were secured in the end of a quill, quills of all sizes from vultures down to doves. The quill was then cut off short and attached to a wooden handle about 9 inches long. And then, in both cases, the hair was then trimmed to the required shape. You get a very good picture in this illustration of what the brushes actually looked like. So we move on to some of the earlier paintings. Fragments of painted plaster survive from the early churches at Jarrow and Monk Wearmouth, but probably the oldest piece of surviving church wall painting was excavated in Winchester by Martin Biddle. This reused piece formed part of the structure of the new minster, its foundations, but it's thought to have been part of the old minster and to date from the late 9th century. So a really early piece in British terms. Probably the earliest paintings to survive in a standing church are the superb angels at Netherwallop, dating from about 1000. They were part of a large composition showing angels round a mandorla, which possibly contained either the Trinity or Christ in Majesty. Sadly, the enlargement of the chancel arch in the 14th century destroyed much of this fine work. The style derives from Carolingian work and relates closely to the manuscripts produced by the Newminster Scriptorium in Winchester. And if you have not been to Netherwallop Church, I would hugely recommend it. Also among the earliest wall paintings that survive are the amazing frescoes at Houghton on the Hill in Norfolk, which are 11th century and possibly even earlier. The east wall seems to be a very early example of a doom painting, with the Trinity and a triple mandorla at centre, incidentally the earliest surviving image of the Trinity in England. Below it are a row of roundels showing Christ at centre, with the godly on his right, our left, and the demons on his left, our right. Below that, an angel blows a trumpet to announce the day of judgment. Other panels on the north and south walls show the creation of Eve and the wheel of fortune. At Coombs in East Sussex, we have the remains of a fine 12th century scheme of wall painting, again executed in fresco. It seems to contain a remarkably full infancy narrative, including the Magi before Herod and the flight into Egypt. Over the chancel arch sits Christ in Majesty, flanked by the symbols of the evangelists, though only St. Mark's Lion remains. Below this is a painting of the Traditio Legis, the giving of the keys to St. Peter and the book to St. Paul. As with other very early wall paintings in England, the Coombs examples, with their elongated, large-eyed figures, have a markedly Greek or Byzantine air, a style of painting that seems to disappear from England in later centuries. In contrast, there's a visual joke at Coombs, which undercuts all this grave seriousness. Painted on the soffit of the chancel arch is a figure literally supporting it. A most unexpected thing to find at this period. And the danger with this is overinterpretation. The straining figure, face reflecting the crushing weight of the burden he bears, may be called an Atlas figure, or it could be an entrance to hell as part of the judgment scene above it. Whatever else the toiling figure is, it's recognizably human and certainly not dignified. Maybe the medieval love of jokes is all the explanation we need. The mid-12th century paintings at Clayton in West Sussex are among the finest of this period and consist of what can only be described as a full church apocalypse. Over the chancel arch, Christ sits flanked by angels and the 12 apostles. Below this, Peter and Paul receive the keys of heaven and the book of God's word. On the north wall, you can see the blessed being welcomed into paradise, while on the south wall, angels display the instruments of Christ's passion. Again, on the north wall, an angel blows a trumpet and another empties a vial over a prostrate figure as the blessed gather and are welcomed into heaven. Lower down the wall, the paintings are in far worse condition, but the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse appear to be riding out. You can see the red horse in that painting. Probably the finest and best known of the 12th century paintings is the Ladder of Souls painting at Chalden in Surrey, occupying most of the west wall of the church. There's really nothing quite like this anywhere else in England. It's said to be the remaining fragment of a larger scheme, including on the north wall, scenes from the fall of man. But nothing remains of this or any other painting in the church. There's an awful lot going on in this painting. The general design shows a central ladder rising from hell to heaven, with souls climbing up and falling down. This, with the boundary between hell and earth, form a cross dividing the painting into 4, containing separate scenes. At the top of the ladder is Christ in glory. At the bottom left, a large devil wielding a pitchfork removes souls from the ladder, while 2 other devils enthusiastically boil them in a huge cauldron, surrounded by 4 groups of small figures representing the deadly sins. From left to right, sloth, gluttony, pride, and anger. In the bottom right-hand quadrant, 2 large demons hold up a spiky bridge, which dishonest tradesmen have to cross. The blacksmith making a horseshoe without his anvil, then a mason without a chisel, the spinners without a distaff, and a potter without a wheel. Below this are the remaining deadly sins: lust, avarice being boiled in a pot by 2 smaller demons, and envy. To the right is the father of lies, the serpent in branches of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Above this is the harrowing of hell. Satan lies on the jaws of hell under Christ's feet, with the cross banner rammed down his throat, while the souls of the righteous emerge from the flames of hell. 2 small souls are personally assisted onto the ladder by an angel. Possibly these represent Enoch and Elisha, the 2 Old Testament figures, who are reported as never having died, but being taken straight up to God. In the other quadrant, St. Michael weighs souls, hampered by another large devil, and an angel escorts the souls to paradise. Dated about 1200, the paintings of Clareley in Shropshire are of a very different nature. Along the north arcade, a full-blown tournament is in progress. It's thought these are battles between virtues and vices, probably deriving from the psychomachia of the 4th century Latin Christian poet Prudentius. In Prudentius's scheme, chastity overcomes lust, patience anger, humility pride, temperance luxury, generosity avarice, and faith discord. It's well nigh impossible to identify the individual vices and virtues in this painting, but possibly the highly dramatic fall from his horse at the right of the picture shows humility's victory over pride. Pride definitely has gone before a fall. Of course, paintings aren't merely decorative. In an era when most congregations were largely illiterate, they provided a means of teaching and reminding the congregation of Christian stories and doctrine. So we now turn to what they do depict and what they don't. And one of the gaps is in Old Testament stories. There seemed a real lack of interest in the scenes from the Old Testament. Even dramatic incidents like the flood, seemingly offering good opportunities for graphic treatment, were largely ignored. A few subjects from Genesis, along with Moses from Exodus, survive. The creation itself is so rare as to be non-existent. but the fall and the expulsion are relatively common. This rather fragmentary painting at Chalfont St. Peter would seem to show the creation of the animals and birds as described in Genesis. We can see 2 birds and 2 beasts and an arm and a sleeve visible at the left. This is an incredibly rare survival, if this is what it is, and it was probably preserved by having the Lord's Prayer painted over it in the 17th century, which, while it complicates the picture, probably preserved it. A surviving fragment of what was clearly an 11th century Genesis sequence is this creation of Eve on the north wall of Houghton on the Hill. You see Eve being pulled out of Adam's body by God. At Hardham, there are a couple of extraordinary Adam and Eve paintings in its scheme of paintings dating from about 1125. Both are on the chancel side of the chancel arch and so would not have been visible to the congregation. These seem to have been there for the priest's edification. They're shown in the last moment of their state of innocence as Eve listens to the serpent and then apparently bathing. A lot of ink has been spilt on exactly what this is all about. My own suspicion is that this is the moment that their eyes were opened and they knew they were naked. They look at their reflection in the water. Anne Marshall, writing about these, wonders how, in passing, how old the rhyme "Adam and Eve and Pinch Me went down to the river to bathe" is, and whether it dates back to that period in some form. On the same wall, but dating to the 14th century, is a panel showing the fall of man and the expulsion from Eden. It's interesting that in this church, all the nudes are the priest's side of the chancel arch. This superb 15th century painting in Broughton in Cambridgeshire shows Adam and Eve now afflicted by the curse of labour. Again, it's quite a rare subject. The heavily bearded Adam, possibly still dressed in the same coat of skin that God gave him, has to drive his spade into the ground, which is littered with stones. Beside him, Eve, with a red robe and her long yellow hair loose, plies her distaff. I don't know when the equality asserting rhyme, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who that was then a gentleman," originated, but it will have been well known by the time this painting was made. The 13th century paintings at Easby in North Yorkshire have been heavily restored by the Victorians, but the original medieval outlines do seem to have been faithfully followed. At the left, we have the creation of Eve, with God grasping Eve firmly by the wrists to haul her out of Adam's side. Beyond to the right, God appears a second time, presenting Eve to Adam, and holding in his draped left hand an object that looks like a book. Possibly this is the painter's way of representing the word, which was there in the beginning. Next to the right comes the temptation and fall. Eve holds out the apple, complete with 2 leaves, to Adam. Further right, in the usual continuous format, a worried-looking Adam sits on the ground, looking back towards Eve, while an angel flies over his head. Eve is now shown sitting with Adam on the ground, pointing dramatically towards the tree, probably putting the blame on the serpent. Next, Adam and Eve are on their feet, Eve wringing her hands, Adam extending his in pointless entreaty towards an implacable angel. Finally, Adam and Eve are out in the world and afflicted by labour, represented here as usual by delving and spinning of tradition. Adam, fully clothed and leaning on his spade, is evidently engaged in debate with an angel. Eve just sits on a mound and spins. Clearly, there's no going back, and she at least is resigned to it. In the embrasure of a window in the north wall of Capel Church in Kent are a pair of 13th century paintings showing the story of Cain and Abel, a very rare subject. On the left, Cain kills Abel with an ass's jawbone. The ass's jawbone as a weapon seems to be peculiar to English iconography. And on the right, he is condemned by God. Capel is a lovely little church run by the Church's Conservation Trust and has got some very interesting wall paintings, and is a charming place to visit, especially on a nice sunny evening, which is when we went. We got in just before the caretaker came to lock the church up.
Glorious views.
In Houghton on the Hill is a very poorly preserved painting thought to be of Noah's Ark. This rather gaudy restoration of it is on display in the church. I think it's using considerable imagination. A now lost painting in Friskney Church in Lincolnshire showed the Israelites gathering manna in the wilderness. It was painted about 1325 and was paired with the Last Supper, which still survives. The episode was seen as a prefiguring of the Last Supper and so became a suitable subject for paintings. This drawing is by Tristan, who did a lot of research and restoring of paintings in the early 20th century. They're not technically an Old Testament story. The tree of Jesse fits as well here as anywhere. Here's what remains of the beautiful version at Chalgrove in Oxfordshire. One might expect to see Jesse lying at the bottom, but at Chalgrove he's represented by an inscription quoting, "And there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." Above the inscription, the painter has reduced the subject to its essentials. In an almond-shaped mandola formed by vine stems, King David plays a harp. In the vine tendrils on either side, praying figures flank him. Directly above David is another mandola, fortunately much clearer, with the Virgin holding the infant Christ, acclaimed by prophets. The need in the medieval church for a female figure to reverence has been recognised by its leaders almost from the start. Mary was the second Eve, unloosing by her obedience what Eve had bound. It was right and inevitable that she should be held in special veneration. So devotion to the Virgin in the Middle Ages was high in England, as it was everywhere in Christendom. The Great Marian Shrine at Walsingham received pilgrims in vast quantities from every corner of the Christian West, and paintings of her abounded. Some show her alone as a devotional figure, but stories about her life, spinning elaborations on the scriptural account, came in from many apocryphal sources. Her espousal, her mother St. Anne teaching her to read, her girlhood spinning or weaving in the temple, her death, burial, assumption, and coronation in heaven, as well as her part in the story of the Nativity and the Passion, were all painted in English churches. Of course, they were a prime target for the reformers too, but it was much easier simply to paint them over than to destroy them. And this lovely, lovely little one is from Beckley in Oxfordshire, and is a fairly rare representation of her actually suckling her child. On the north wall of the church at Corby Glen, Lincolnshire, is this charming painting dating to about 1325 of St. Anne teaching the Virgin to read. The subject has its origins in the considerable body of apocryphal tales about the girlhood of the Virgin and about her life and death generally, and was very popular both in wall paintings and stained glass. The Virgin's mother is the taller figure of the left, dressed like a pious 14th century lady and with her left arm around her daughter. The Virgin is dressed in a robe, which was once blue, haloed like St. Anne, and with her hair loose. This is an unusually lively Annunciation. It's in the chancel of Martley Church in Worcestershire and brings the scene to life. Gabriel, barefoot, holding a scroll in his left hand, salutes Mary with his right. His voluminous robes have traces of what looks like gold-coloured pigment on them, and he probably once had a gold halo. Mary, wearing similar ample draperies, also has conspicuously bare feet, which is a very unusual detail. Very often, Mary is the only figure in the group, and she can be identified because she's wearing shoes. Presenting the Virgin unshod like this stresses her ordinariness until this moment, and her humility as well. There's a real sense of communication between the angel and Mary, and it's perhaps emphasized by the fact that this is a different way around from usual Annunciations. Usually the angel appears on the left and Mary is on the right. Here it's reversed. This is a detail from the Holy Infancy fresco on the north wall of St. Clement's Church in Ashamstead in Berkshire, and it shows Mary's visit to the home of her cousin Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother. Beautifully painted, these ones. Now, the painted pillar dated to 1306 in Faversham in Kent is a rare survival. Probably there were a lot more pillars like this, but very few survive, even in part. Among the scenes shown is a sequence of the infancy of Christ. In the nativity scene, Mary is giving her baby the breast and looks as uncomfortable and worried as any new mother. Round the corner of the pillar, Joseph, very much disfigured, appears to be just catching up on his sleep. We now move to the end of Mary's life. At Broughton in Oxfordshire, there's a 14th century series of paintings of the death of the Virgin, starting with one of the rarer motifs, the angel announcing her impending death. The story, based on various apocryphal sources, tells how, After her son's death and resurrection, Mary longed to be reunited with him, and her prayers that she might soon die and go to heaven were answered in due course, when an angel, usually identified as Gabriel, came to her, presented her with a palm branch, and announced that she would receive her wish in 3 days' time. So here the angel kneels down and hands her the palm branch. 40 miles or so away at Chalgrove is another Death of the Virgin sequence in rather better condition. Here, Mary breaks the news of her impending death to her friends and to the apostles. Her friends seem quite resigned to it. The apostles seem a lot more upset. Their positions with a hand to the face of grieving. Still at Chalgrove, Christ stands at the head of the bed as Mary breathes her last, and 2 small angels at the right take her soul up to heaven. At Purton, the scene is much more reminiscent of the Eastern Church. It shows a dormition rather than a death. Mary falls peacefully asleep, surrounded by the apostles. There is no sign of Christ at the bedside or of angels bearing away her soul. The Chalgrove sequence shows the funeral of the Virgin. The bier, draped in an elaborately patterned pole, is carried by a group of apostles at either end, with Peter probably at the head of the procession on the far left. Also shown here is the incident of the Jewish priest's attempt to interrupt the procession by leaping onto the bier to overturn it. The priest, named Jephonias, in one of the early apocryphal accounts, is shown clinging with one hand to the upper edge of the bier, to which his hand has stuck. 2 of his companions, only partly preserved in this picture, are shown below on the ground, having been struck blind like their leader for their sacrilege. Unusually, though, the next scene shows St. John, now holding the palm of paradise given to Mary, restoring Jephonias' sight. In his right hand, St. John holds an aspergillum with which he sprinkles the high priest. In the Middle Ages, there were many similar stories of attempted sacrilege directed at Christian rites by Jews. Irretrievably stuck hands often feature, as does magnanimous healing intervention by Christians or even Christ himself. And of course, instant repentance and conversion. At Broughton, there's also a fairly clear Assumption of the Virgin, witnessed by Thomas, to whom she hands her girdle. You can just see him at the lower right-hand side, catching the girdle as she drops it. The final episode in Mary's story is shown at Pickering, the coronation of the Virgin as Queen of Heaven. Mary sits between the Father and the Son, while the Spirit, in the form of a dove, places the crown on her head. They're surrounded by the apostles, led by an ostentatiously tonsured Peter. This painting presumably survived the reformers, as it's so inaccessible, right up at the top of the north wall. We now move on to the life of Christ. At Ashhampstead in Berkshire, there's a very high quality Life of the Virgin and Infancy cycle dating to about 1250. Here we see the nativity scene. Mary lies horizontally across the picture on a bed or couch with elegant draperies. She stretches out a hand towards Joseph, who's the larger figure, seated above at the right. Beside him is a smaller figure, probably the midwife Salome, the believing midwife who did not question Mary's virginity. To the left is a manger holding the Christ child lying in it, while the ox at the left and the ass at the right feed. It's all of surprisingly elaborate design, but the fancy manger does mean that it's suitably raised and can be seen without being obscured by the Virgin and her bed. The whole scene is enclosed in a tripartite arch with twin pointed towers. It's rather tempting to think this is a painter's memory of the Church of the Nativity itself. The arch recurs in the painting of the angel and the shepherds. Here, the painter's stylistic flair can be seen in the dramatically unfurling wings of the angel. He points with his right arm and hand to the group of shepherds further right, and what looks like the end of a girdle floating out from him at waist level is probably a speech scroll, once bearing the words of his salutation, "Fear not." There are 3 shepherds. One nearest the angel, wearing a dark red robe, has his hand to his hat. A second, behind and partly obscured by him, plays the pipes. And the third shepherd, we don't know much about him except that his leg, foot, and staff survives. In the center of the scene are 2 small dogs. One painted in red looks towards the angel, while another painted in white and with a curly tail is shown facing his master. At Edstaston in Shropshire is a beautiful early 14th century painting of the Adoration of the Magi. Unfortunately, it's been partly obliterated by a series of 18th and 19th century memorials, but enough remains to show the quality of the work. At the extreme right, holding a very elaborately floriated scepter, is the Virgin Mary. Only her left side is visible now, and the child was presumably held on her lap further right. Next to the Virgin at the left is one of the Magi, standing under a rounded painted arch and holding a large goblet-like object, probably frankincense. The next king is easier to see, though his gift has been reduced to a few meaningless patches of dark pigment. But it was probably gold. He looks left at the last king, gesturing towards the Christ child. The third king also gestures forward, holding a bulbous pear-shaped container with a stopper, probably myrrh. On the east wall of the Chancellor Brook Church in Kent is a roundel showing the flight into Egypt, painted about 1250. Joseph, on the right, leads the donkey on which Mary sits, holding an apparently wriggling baby Jesus tightly against her face and neck. Joseph carries a T-shaped staff with what look like bundles of possessions carried over it on his shoulder. Also shown in this series is the Fall of the Idols, an entirely apocryphal tale from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. According to the story, Mary, Joseph, and the child entered an Egyptian city, where in search of lodgings they went into a pagan temple, as one does. Immediately the idols worshipped there fell down and shattered. Conversions to Christianity ensued. Understandably, the Brook painter has chosen to show only one representative idol. Framed within what is probably intended as the portico of the temple, a sinister-looking creature with horns and a suggestion of bat-like wings falls headfirst from a large plinth. On the Faversham painted pillar, there's an uncommon scene, the presentation of Christ in the temple. The scene bends around three sides of the pillar, with a figure on each. Joseph is at the far left, wearing the kind of round, shallow-crowned hat sometimes seen in medieval art on Jews. He holds a round basket in the crook of his arm, steadying it with his right. When Tristram studied this, he could see traces of at least 3 doves, but none are left now. Mary forms a scene with Simeon, linked by the infant Jesus wrapped round the angle formed by the 2 faces of the pillar. Simeon extends his hands across a carefully draped altar to receive the child, who may himself be raising a hand in blessing. At Shorthampton in Oxfordshire is a 15th century painting of the miracle of the clay birds. This is a great rarity, one of the apocryphal childhood miracles of Christ. According to the legend in the Gospel of Nicodemus, the child Jesus, playing one day in the mud, took some of it and modelled it into birds. When he clapped his hands, they came to life and flew away. At Shorthampton, he is shown on his mother's right arm, holding out one of the clay birds to the child, probably his half-brother James, on her other arm. Another of the roundels at Brook shows the young Christ with the scholars in the temple, a very unusual subject. Within the roundel, the interior of the temple is represented by a triple round-arched arcade and a suggestion of high windows or distant buildings. Its appearance may well be based on first-hand experience, since Jerusalem was the ultimate destination for all medieval pilgrims. Below this, Christ, identifiable by his round halo, is seated centrally, flanked by 2 figures in rabbinical headgear, and the faint figure standing at the right is the Virgin Mary, in search of her missing son. Christ has his feet on a footstool, an ancient symbol of authority and kingship that also emphasizes his lack of inches. In Cerne Abbas Church in Dorset is a 14th century sequence of the life of John the Baptist, which includes a scene showing the baptism of Christ. Christ stands centrally with a halo and a loincloth, his hands clasped before him in prayer. At the left is John, reaching upwards towards Christ's head. Part of his head, robe, and his legs and feet are reasonably clear, but he's rather a vague figure otherwise. Another figure may stand beside him, and at the right is an angel holding garments. Also at Brook is an extremely rare subject of the temptation in the wilderness. This is a bit like a strip cartoon. In the center, we've got Christ standing on top of the pinnacle of the temple. In the second of the 3 incidents that make up the temptation, his right arm is extended and he holds a scroll, now indecipherable along with all the rest of the scrolls in the scene. Below him and slightly to the left, a now very vague figure holds up an arm towards him, and it's clear enough that a conversation is taking place. The other instances of the threefold temptation are here too. At the far left of the roundel, Christ, identifiable by his halo, appears again, with beyond him to the right another figure, presumably Satan, raising his right arm and hand, the thumb clearly visible. This is the temptation to turn stones into bread. Finally, at the right of the roundel, Christ, his speech scroll curving upwards, looks down at a figure shown in profile, whose grotesquely hooked nose and raised stabbing finger confirm him as Satan, offering Christ the temporal kingdoms of the world and all their power. For some reason, paintings of Christ's earthly ministry are very rare. An exception to this is the raising of Jairus' daughter at Copford Green in Essex, painted around 1200 and restored in the 19th century. They're grouped in an illusionistic lunette or half-moon shape, and the scene is divided into two by a central pillar. The idea was obviously to suggest an inner room on the left and the vestibule and entrance to Jairus' house on the right. Jairus' daughter lies in bed, a weeping woman, presumably her mother, standing beside her. In the doorway between the two rooms, Jairus stands pointing to the inner chamber and begging Christ to help. Christ himself, who has a tripartite halo, stands at the right. His pose is unusual in that both his legs are crossed, with underdrawings of the limbs visible, where an area of lower drapery has faded. Since this painting is true fresco, completed in a single phase on wet plaster, what we see here may be the painter working out his ideas about the articulation of the figures as he went along, and perhaps changing his mind in the process. There is another figure, probably Peter, at the extreme right. But we go back to Brooke for a roundel showing the raising of Lazarus, painted in about 1250. Little detail is left, but it is just possible to identify a rectangular open coffin with figures standing round. Christ himself is the figure standing at second left, and the figure bending over the coffin at the far right is probably Mary or Martha. There are two figures, one at the extreme left and another, possibly tonsured, behind the other end of the coffin on the right. The painter has not tried to reproduce the cave with a stone on it of John's Gospel. Instead, it's a strong resemblance to the medieval burials found in scenes of burying the dead from the 7 Works of Mercy. You can just make out the knotted shroud at the left of the picture, and possibly a red cross on the winding sheet of the figure in the coffin, making the point that Lazarus is truly dead and buried. At Stoke Newington is a delightful passion narrative, clearly painted by a local painter in the 15th century. Some scenes are well preserved, including the entry into Jerusalem. The painstakingly painted walls of the city have a spiked portcullis over its arched door, and on its castellated top stand 3 people, all in the act of throwing down branches of foliage into the path of the approaching donkey, on whose back Christ rides. Immediately following this scene is the agony in the garden, something of a rarity. Christ, the tallest figure in the scene, kneels in the center, either holding out the cup or gesturing towards it. 2 figures in red mantles below him are shown in attitudes suggesting sleep, and there may have been others behind. The next clear scene is the flagellation. Christ stands centrally, covered in blood, while 2 men beat him with staves. The top of the column to which he is bound shows above his head. The next scene is the road to Calvary, and it features Christ's mother Mary helping him carry the cross. A much more puzzling feature is the presence of a man in a round turban-like hat on the right, apparently seated, cross-legged, with one pointed black-shod foot extended forward. One possibility is that this is Ahasuerus, who supposedly refused to let Christ rest on his doorstep, and consequently passed into folklore as the wandering Jew. There's another man in a red tunic standing behind him. This is followed by the crucifixion. 2 women stand at the left, the one nearest the cross, certainly the Virgin Mary. Another figure in a red robe kneels, but it's difficult to be sure whether this is St. John or Mary Magdalene. On the right stand 2 armored figures. Scenes of the deposition and burial follow, and then we have the resurrection. 4 soldiers, all at least partly visible, are shown in sleeping postures around a rectangular sarcophagus as Christ steps out of it, holding the vexillum banner of the resurrection. It looks as though this is followed by a post-resurrection scene to the far right, but it's very difficult to be certain. but it may well be the Noli Me Tangere. In the 15th century Passion narrative of Pickering, we see the arrest of Jesus healing Malchus's ear as Peter sheathes his sword, and Christ brought before Pilate, or possibly Caiaphas. A Bat Child in Kent is a beautiful 14th century painting of the crucifixion with Mary and John and attendant angels. Christ hangs on the cross in the centre with Mary at the left and John at the right, holding a book in his left hand. Beyond these two figures on either side is a larger scale angel, each of which holds a rectangular object, possibly also a book. The painting must once have served as an altarpiece, and it's probable, since the north chancel aisle is the earliest part of the church, that this was once the high altar, below what was then the main east window. At Brent Ely in Suffolk, is another painted altarpiece or reredos. Probably dates from the early 14th century and is very high quality work. The figures of the crucified Christ, the Virgin Mary, and St. John are elegantly poised in the S-curve typical of the period, with the folds of the robes in flowing, graceful configurations. The green, probably malachite, is the background, patchy now, and that's very unusual in parish church paintings of any date. Paintings that have it are usually of very fine quality, and this is no exception. By contrast, the 15th century crucifixion at Barnby in Suffolk is a very rare appearance of the two thieves. Here the painter has managed to suggest something other than a straightforward row of crucified figures, all facing squarely to the front, which is the usual way of doing it. So something of this shows in the articulation of the figure at the left of the photograph, but it's most marked in the way that the other thief and his cross are disposed at the right, where the painters clearly tried to angle the cross on the figure so that the thief appears to be further back into the implied distance. It all leads to a rather lively painting. In this sequence at Easby, we see the deposition from the cross, the burial, and the Marys arriving at the tomb. The painting has been heavily restored, but it doesn't seem to depart much from the original. And this is the Harrowing of Hell, part of the Pickering Passion narrative. It was very heavily restored in the Victorian period, and there's an awful lot of debate as to whether the odd modesty discs are a bowdlerizing creation of the restorers or an original medieval idea, perhaps showing the non-sexual nature of eternal life. I think the jury is completely out on this one. It really does depend on who you read as to which view you take. Right at the top of the east wall of the nave at St Mary's Kempley is a scene that is difficult to see and not a common one in English wall paintings. It shows the three Marys arriving at the empty tomb and being greeted by an angel. At the left is the faint and incomplete outline of the angel, shown upright as if standing and in sharp profile. To the right of this are the three Marys, three faint figures whose lower bodies are obscured by what seems to be a great tent-like swathe of drapery, with again, apparently, the top of a cross on a long shaft at the apex. The cross is probably later, and nothing to do with the scene, though it might be a dedication cross. Whether this also applies to the drapery is harder to decide. It might be contemporary with the three Marys, but it's hard to believe that having painted these almost processional figures, a painter would then mask them with this kind of decorative detail, unless it has some real symbolic significance. One possibility is that it's intended as a veil drawn over the sepulchre itself, concealing the mystery of the resurrection. However, when the paintings at Kempley were discovered in 1872, there were various layers of painting on the nave walls, and the simplest explanation, that this drapery is a later overlay, may well be the correct one. In the CCT-owned church at Little Witchingham in Norfolk, the 14th century Passion cycle includes a picture of Doubting Thomas. In a rare surviving example of this scene, St. Thomas kneels at the left in front of a tree painted in the background. The Bible account of Christ's appearance to the apostles, when Doubting Thomas was present, seems to imply that this event took place indoors, and there's no account of any actual touching. But the painter has shown Christ guiding Thomas's hand to the wound in his side, and the kneeling figure seems to be a bearded man, clinching the identification. Thomas seems to be holding a book. Apocryphal writings, including an Acts of Thomas, a Gospel of Thomas, and an Infancy Gospel of Thomas, were all confidently attributed to him in the medieval period. We now move on to the saints. I can't hope to give more than a cursory glance at the huge range of saints shown on church walls. Some are almost always present, such as St. Christopher and St. George, while others are very rarely shown, such as St. Cuthbert. Here we see the wolf finding the decapitated head of St. Edmund, a 14th century painting found in Padbury in Buckinghamshire. St. Edmund died in East Anglia in 869 AD, and one of the more persistent legends about him was that his severed head was found and guarded by a wolf until searchers found it. At the left, a crouching wolf has its jaws set with very sharp teeth, locked firmly around the lower part of the head, while a rescuer at the upper right is probing it rather gingerly with a long pole or spear. St. Christopher was almost universal and usually placed opposite the main door so that travellers could look on St. Christopher and go their way in safety. One of my favourites is this late 15th century example at Brieg in West Cornwall. The Church of St. Breaca houses many important late medieval wall paintings, ranging from St. Christopher to the vanishingly obscure St. Corentin and Henry VI. To the left of the north door can be seen the figure of St. Christopher, bearing the Christ child on his shoulder and carrying a staff to help him cross the river. St. Christopher is a huge bearded figure who appears to be crossing the sea, as the water at the bottom left includes a mermaid holding a mirror surrounded by flatfish. Above her, seated in a small clinker boat, is a hermit-like figure wearing a cowl, and on the horizon is a ship in full sail. St. Christopher was a very popular subject of 15th century wall paintings. He was thought to protect travellers and was also considered to have powers against the bubonic plague, particularly relevant at the time this was painted, when an epidemic of plague was raging in Cornwall. In these two spectacular figures from Pickering, we see the two firm favourites of wall painters, St. George defeating the dragon and St. Christopher, complete with a hermit, who usually maintained the river crossing. Unlike the Brieg painting, the water they cross is clearly a river, with a fine eel twining round the saint's ankle. At Pickering too, we have a detailed account of the martyrdom of St. Catherine of Alexandria, beginning at the top left with pagan idol worship, which she protests against. Then she's imprisoned and dragged and then released from it, disputes with 50 philosophers and converts them to Christianity instead. They're condemned and burnt. In the middle of the second tier, Catherine's back in prison, where the further right, she's brought out and scourged with the emperor looking on. The next row shows her thrust back into prison again, before being brought out to be condemned with the now converted empress. Both women are shown kneeling, attended by angels. Catherine appears again, flanked by the 4 wheels with which she was tortured. They're shown in fragments as divine intervention broke them. The lowest tier is entirely taken up with the final scene in Catherine's life, her beheading. She kneels, her long hair over her face and her royal crown on the ground beside the emperor's chair, and a hovering angel blesses her as the executioner raises his sword. We now move to a few less well-known and less common saints. At Wareham in Dorset is a 12th century sequence showing the life of St. Martin of Tours. This particular picture shows him dividing his cloak with the beggar. Martin leans down from his horse, the cloak round his shoulders and at those of the beggar, and divides it with his sword. The story of St. Eloy shoeing a possessed horse appears both at Slapton, Northamptonshire, and Wensley. Eloy was not only Bishop of Noyon in France in the first half of the 7th century, but he was a goldsmith and a metalworker of great renown. And the best known legend attached to him concerns his shoeing of a horse possessed by the devil. The animal was quite uncontrollable, and Eloy solved the problem of shoeing it by removing its leg, then restoring it with a new shoe in place. In the Slapton version, we see an attendant holding the amputated leg, while the saint in full episcopal garb works on it, the 3-legged horse taking centre stage. Up above is an utterly unrelated painting of St. Anne teaching the Virgin to read. In the Wensley version, a huntsman with a bow over his shoulder and arrows at his belt controls a suitably devilish-looking horse, wide-eyed and grinning malevolently. Below, Eloy, wearing what seems to be clerical vestments, and perhaps with a tonsure, wields a hammer. South Newington has several fine paintings, including a rare survival dating from about 1330, the murder of Thomas Becket. Paintings of Becket were common throughout the Middle Ages, but as a rebel against his king, he was one of Henry VIII's least favourite saints, and he was expunged from church walls, textiles, and manuscripts with great enthusiasm by the reformers. The painting of the murder of Becket is badly damaged, but it remains one of the finest medieval wall paintings in England. Unusually, it's painted in oils, probably an emulsion of oil with some other medium such as egg tempera, but it gives the paintings an extraordinary shine. Further to its right, an altar is covered with an elaborate red and green cloth, and behind the altar is what's left of the figure of Edward Grimm, Becket's chaplain. He holds a book and his right hand is extended across the altar, on which hand stands a chalice. Thomas, fortunately clear, though he tends to merge with the background a bit now, kneels before the altar, hands extended in prayer, vested for mass. The sword that struck his head is still embedded in it. The sword is held by a knight in a blue surcoat standing just left of centre. Reginald Fitzurse, said to have been the first to strike, has evidently already done so, because he can be seen standing directly behind Thomas, identified by the bear, Horsa, on his surcoat. This is really indefinite now, rather indefinite now, but standing, the bear is facing towards the right, on all fours with head lowered, directly below his sword belt. The remaining two knights are further left, the second from the left wearing a yellow ochre surcoat, and the other most nearly completed the four, shown in the act of drawing his sword. Sizable areas of him are missing, but his legs, his right arm and hand drawing his sword, his bent left arm and hand steadying his scabbard, and most of his head with its chainmail coif are all visible. It's absolutely extraordinary painting. At Pittington in County Durham, we find a window splay painted about 1175 with scenes of the life of St. Cuthbert. In the left-hand splay, Cuthbert is consecrated bishop. Cuthbert's the tonsured figure kneeling at the left, having holy oil poured on his head by Archbishop Theodore. The crown man at the far right of the scene is probably King Egfrith of Northumbria, who was present at the consecration in York. The painting on the right-hand splay of the window shows St. Cuthbert's vision at the table of Abbess Elfleda of Whitby, a close friend whom he visited more than once. Cuthbert, who had by this time become Bishop of Lindisfarne, and Elfleda met on this occasion on Coquet Island off the coast of Northumberland. Eating at her table, the knife fell from his hand as he saw in a vision the soul of a holy man being taken to heaven. Below the scrollwork at the top of the painting, the holy man's soul is shown as a small figure lying horizontally across the space, head at the right, legs in the air, and one hand extended downwards. The saint's story relates that at that moment, a messenger came in with the news that one of Elfleda's servants had fallen to his death from a tree. This messenger is the young man in a light brown tunic at the far right of the scene, speaking to Elfleda, who wears a green veil round her head and raises her right hand from the table in shock. Cuthbert, in his red cloak, grips the edge of the table with his left hand as the truth of his vision is confirmed. St. Anthony and his pig are shown in the early 14th century painting in Barton, Cambridgeshire. St. Anthony of Egypt was a skilled debater and a hermit and a miracle worker with a reputation for healing animals as well as people. In particular, pigs belonging to the order he founded were permitted to roam at liberty, and the pig eventually passed into iconography as the emblem of the saint. Outbreaks of the horrifying and almost always fatal disease, St. Anthony's fire, were frequent and widespread during the Middle Ages. The Hospitallers of the Antonine order specialized in its treatment, and Anthony became a hugely popular saint. Images of St. Francis of Assisi are extremely rare in English churches. This image at Slapton, which probably dates from the 15th century, shows him receiving the stigmata during his vision on Mount Averna in 1224. The image is a straightforward one of Christ on the cross at the left, with black lines, still partly visible, radiating from the crucified figure and meeting Francis at the various points on his body where the stigmata appeared. And finally, of the saints, at Hawley in Oxfordshire is a late 15th century painting of St. Zita. She was a household servant in Lucca in Italy, and at first her piety and frequent ecstasies irritated her employers, but eventually her persevering devotion gained her respect. A popular but local cult grew up on her death, spreading later to many other countries, including England, though she was not formally canonized till the early 16th century. She's the patron saint of housewives and of lost keys. And you can see she's holding an enormous key in one hand and surrounded by domestic implements. After St. Christopher, the Doom or Last Judgment was probably the subject most commonly painted in the medieval church. The standard placings above the chancel arch, because of the symbolism associated with the division between nave and chancel. The division separated the priest's domain in the chancel from that of the people in the nave, but it also symbolically marked the divide between the church militant here on earth and the church expectant, the souls in purgatory, from the church triumphant in heaven. But this placing is only standard, not invariable, and many dooms are elsewhere in medieval churches. In the Guild Chapel at Stratford-on-Avon, much remains of a fine doom painting over the chancel arch. The outlines of the rood figures remain in the centre. They are presumably relief figures on a rood shelf placed above a lower rood screen, as the painting continues below them. Sadly, while it's thought the upper portion of the painting survives, the insertion of an 18th century ceiling means it's not visible. This computer-assisted reconstruction gives much more idea of what it would have looked like. In the centre is Christ throned above a rainbow, with the earth at his feet, flanked by Mary and John the Baptist. Below him, the dead rise from their graves. We went to visit the superb dome above the chancel arch at St. Thomas's Church, Salisbury. This is what we were hoping to see. We were pleasantly surprised to find the church open at 5 o'clock on Friday evening, only to be confronted with this. But it's a wonderful painting. It will soon, hopefully, be visible again, and the details of the sinners going to hell are particularly lively. The glory of South Lee Church in Oxfordshire is the painting on the walls extending right round the church. Above the chancel, archangels blow trumpets summoning the dead rising from their graves. And it seems likely that here too, the roof has been lowered, losing the top half of the painting. On the south side, the damned, bundled together with a spiked rope, are welcomed into hell by devils. And on the north wall, St. Peter welcomes the blessed. As well as the doom over the chancel, there's a wonderful 15th century weighing of souls on the south wall. A spectacular and apparently left-handed St. Michael holds the scales while brandishing a huge sword. What does become apparent, though, is that this isn't the first painting of this theme on this patch of wall. Showing through is another smaller rectangular frame where we can see the head of an angel holding something like a pair of scales and another hell mouth. There's an extraordinary doom at Bishopsbourne Church in Kent. No chancel arch in this church, so the arcades are covered with paintings dating from the first years of the 14th century. In the centre of the south arcade, we have a very lively weighing of souls. The soul on the left of the picture is clearly outweighing the scale pan full of scrolls. The small demon scrambles up the voussoirs, reaching up to try and reverse the judgment. At the west end of the north arcade is the result of the weighing of souls. Sadly, the insertion of a later window has destroyed what must have been heaven, though an angel stands ready to conduct the blessed there. What is left is the descent to hell. At the bottom is a very toothy hell mouth, and a pair of demons armed with flesh hooks haul enthusiastically at the chain that binds a selection of the damned to bring them down to their level. But the most extraordinary and terrifying element of the series is in the middle of the north arcade opposite St. Michael. Pevsner refers to it as a Christ of justice. This unique figure shows a figure naked except for a cloak and armed to and beyond the teeth. 6 swords spring from his head and more from elbows and heels, and another hangs from his waist. In his left hand, he carries a bow and arrows, while in his right hand, he plunges a spear into a figure kneeling in prayer. This would seem to be a figure of Christ as he appears in Revelation 19. And out of his mouth goes the sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations. And we move quickly on to Moralities. From the early 13th century, I've not got much, I think, a series of papal edicts stressed the importance for lay people to make regular confessions to their priest, during which they'd be questioned about their knowledge and practice of key Christian beliefs. Paintings started to appear in churches aimed at helping people get a grasp of these principles and behaviours, which came to be known as pieties or moralities. They included the 7 deadly sins, the 7 acts of corporeal mercy, and warnings to sinners of various types. Other miscellaneous themes included the labours of the month, the wheels of fortune, and life and the zodiac. Fortune and life and the zodiac. The gospel account of Christ's judgment bases salvation on how people treat each other. Christ lists 6 actions which should be done: feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick, and visiting prisoners, saying that whenever they're done for one's fellows, they're done for him. These actions became known as the corporal acts of mercy. The horrors of the Black Death, coupled with a mystical emphasis on the number 7, led to the introduction of a 7th act of mercy, the burial of the dead. This painting of the 7 corporeal acts of mercy at Wickhampton in Norfolk has a layout which leaves a blank panel, which is filled by Christ blessing the merciful and welcoming them into heaven. One's record was judged on the sin that, if unabsolved, would doom you to damnation. The 7 deadly sins: pride, lust, anger, avarice, gluttony, sloth, and envy. Many of the representations of the 7 deadly sins show pride as the chief of the sins, from whom come the other 6, but probably none so graphically as this example of Rounds in Northamptonshire. Pride is shown as a well-dressed woman. She is pierced by a spear wielded by Death, and the other 6 sins emerge from her. Most of the sins are hard to identify, but lust is very clear. The figure below seems to show avarice clutching an armful of coins. In the southwest corner of St. Cadoc's Church in Lancartham are the remains of a spectacular painting of the 7 deadly sins from the 15th century. Here sin is seen as a nest of dragons, with pride in the form of an extremely glamorous king, crowned by demons and wielding a huge scimitar-like sword. Next in importance are anger, where 2 men are held locked in a duel by a huge grinning devil, and Acedia, not usually shown as sloth, but here seen as despair, who is helped by a toasting fork-wielding demon to commit suicide. Below, 2 demons drive a lustful couple into each other's embrace. On the west wall, we see avarice at his counting bench, and a less conventionally deadly sin, perhaps deliberately making a point at the 15th century parishioners, is somnolence. Here, a parishioner oversleeps on Sunday, despite the vigorous ringing of the church bell. His head clutching implies that gluttony may have caused this. And round the corner is gluttony, bursting out of his clothes and being force-fed beer by another devil. Along the whole north wall of the Guild Chapel of the Holy Cross at Stratford-on-Avon, and well nigh impossible to pick out, runs a Dance of Death, a copy of the painting in St. Paul's Cloister in London, based on a poem by John Lydgate, where death appears to a huge range of people to lead them in a dance to hell. Its extent is made clearer by this reconstruction of the wall made by York University. A better preserved painting on such gloomy themes in the Guild Chapel is the Earth Upon Earth painting. Dating from the 15th century, it shows an angel flanked by handsome buildings and 2 men regarding a shrouded and worm-eaten corpse. Running between these figures are scrolls bearing verses from the 14th century poem, Earth Upon Earth, which plays on dust thou art and to dust thou shalt return. Related to the Dance of Death is the motif of the 3 living and the 3 dead, a morality tale that sees 3 kings meet 3 skeletons who say something to the effect of, as you are, we once were, as we are, so shall you be. It was originally a secular story made popular at the 13th century French court, but by the 15th century, the motif emerged in devotional lay manuals, often accompanying Office of the Dead liturgical prayers. This painting is at Rounds in Northamptonshire and occupies most of the north arcade next to the 7 deadly sins, a very sobering juxtaposition. The Sunday Christ, otherwise known as a warning to Sabbath breakers, is aimed at those who stay away from church for work or play on Sundays and holy days. Christ stands centrally, occasionally crowned as at Brieg, and covered in drops of blood, and the various surrounding implements often touch him. Working or playing on the Sabbath inflicts new wounds on Christ is the clear enough message. This example from St. Justin in Penwith shows a community growing rich on mining, fishing, and building, the tools of which surround him. At nearby Brieg is probably the finest example. Probably originally painted in the 15th century, the face and the outline have been retouched. The figure is covered with wounds and blood, and there seems a real aim to shock. Many of the implements are placed to appear to wound Christ, and spurts of blood linked to other items on his body. Analysis has shown that this paint was water-based, and in addition to the standard charcoal and ochre pigments, use is made of a copper-based green, probably verdigris, and maybe a byproduct of local mining. You can see the implements there. A different way of wounding Christ is seen in this late 15th century paint, warning against swearers of Broughton in Buckinghamshire. Here, the central group is a Pieta, with the grieving Virgin holding her badly mutilated son in her lap. Surrounding the 2 central figures are 9 young men, all dressed in the height of fashion. They hold various items, most of them body parts. From the top right, a handful of bones, a heart, a hand. The remaining figure, third from the right, may be holding or indicating Christ's head. The three standing men in the lower half of the painting hold a foot, a cross with a host with a cross on it, and more bones. At the lower centre, two men sit either side of a backgammon board. One has drawn his sword and strikes the other, who seems to be holding a cross on the head. The warning is directed at those who swear by parts of Christ's body, or sacramental symbols like his cross or the sacrament itself. These oaths were obviously common, not only in the 15th century, and not only from the lips of fashion-conscious young men, according to all accounts. King John was evidently heard to swear by God's feet. Parish priests inveighed against the blasphemous habit, assuring swearers their words wounded Christ anew, and they would pay for them in the end. But presumably to very little effect. The association with gaming, here the backgammon board, is strong. At Slapton in Northamptonshire, we find a 14th century warning against idle gossip. This is one of the few examples of the subject still remaining in the English church. And although its main lines and areas are clear, much detail has been lost. Two women sit on a bench just below the centre of the picture, heads turned towards each other and clearly in the middle of an absorbed and intimate conversation. A few rudimentary facial features can still be made out. Behind them looms an enormous devil with great horns, probably Tituvulus, who specialised in this sin. His face, some of his chest, and any legs he may have had are gone, but his arms are flexed at the elbows so as to cram the two heads of the women together. At Melbourne in Derbyshire is a 14th century painting which may represent the warning against gossip again, but is possibly a warning against female vanity. The women below the overarching demon appear to be struggling over a mirror. Each woman has another devil on her back, and there's possibly a very small black devil in the centre. The principal devil above bears a scroll, possibly bearing the legend, Hic est cella diabol. This is the hideout of the devil. There are medieval products about women looking in mirrors in certain conditions, or certain times of day, or month, or year, seeing the devil reflected there. Other subjects include the wheel of life, representing the 10 ages of men. This example from St. Mary's Kemperley shows a woman seated with a child, a boy, a youth, a young man on a white horse, king on his throne, an elderly man, a blind old man guided by a boy, an old man in bed, a coffin, and a tomb. Equally rare is the wheel of fortune, where at random the king may fall or the lowly rise to fame. This example is in the choir of Rochester Cathedral. And so, with the spectacular doom at Holy Trinity Church, Coventry, we come to the end. I hope once lockdown's over, this encourages you to seek out some of these amazing painted churches. And in the next talk I will be looking in a lot more detail at Sunday Christ figures, because they fascinate me. And there we are. I'm sorry I've overrun a bit, but